Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation, to this round table here today. When I thought about organizing this series of talks, I immediately knew that I wanted to devote one session to those patients who are too ill to attend the talks and to speak out and speak with us. As most of you know, there are large differences between the severity of symptoms that folks with long COVID, ME, and other post-viral conditions experience. To be sure, when someone suffers from these diseases, they are all really sick and often disabled in many elements of their lives, physically, but also socially and emotionally. But there's a difference between people who can still work for a few hours a day or walk their dogs or see friends, and those who are completely bedbound, who cannot tolerate any touch or light or other things, let alone take a shower or make a phone call. Because of the nature of post-viral conditions, many, if not most, patients cannot advocate for themselves. Activities, as we discussed before, can lead to PEM and make your condition worse. This means that others often step up and speak for them. For example, activists in health activism, but also on a more intimate scale when family members speak for patients during doctor's appointments. Politically, it is important to speak for those who are very ill, because otherwise they might remain completely invisible and their suffering would go unnoticed. But speaking for is also dangerous business. If you don't listen to those that you speak for, you might repeat false or stereotypical views about them. And the whole system of speaking and political speech at the moment is very much based on the right of the loudest, as I call it, which also shapes the discourse around illness and the value of different forms of living in problematic ways. I also want to note that different forms of oppression can shape the possibilities that humans have to speak out and be heard. Just last week, I read an article about people from ethnic minority groups in the UK who are, and I quote, disproportionately affected by COVID-19, less likely to access primary health care, and have reported dissatisfaction with healthcare. Although the prevalence of long COVID in ethnic minority groups is unclear, such populations are underrepresented in long COVID specialist clinics and long COVID lived experience research, which informed the original long COVID healthcare guidelines. So they are excluded from practices that generate knowledge, in addition to being excluded from healthcare. In addition to cultural stigma, and with cultural stigma, I mean cultural stigma in and between cultures. Other factors matter. For example, gender. The majority of patients with post-acute infectious syndromes are female, as we discussed with Paula Moore, which can lead, which has led to problematic attitudes from the medical world. For example, including accusations of hysteria and psychologization. And this is also a topic that Vivienne's workshop will discuss on the 3rd of February, but we can maybe return to that later. In addition to gender, cultural stereotypes, and so on, poverty, of course, plays a role. And there are many other factors that influence the possibilities for people to speak out, and that lead to certain patterns of silencing. Feminist philosophers like, for example, Linda Elkoff, have discussed the dangers, but also the importance of speaking for others who are being silenced and excluded from the discourse. Elkoff writes that when you are in a position of power, when you have the right to speak and the capacity to speak, it is often necessary to speak out for those who are not, for reasons of justice. And we never have the full truth about any position, including our own. So we should not stay silent when facing injustice for fear of not representing everyone completely correctly. At the same time, this speaking for others should be based on the dialogue that we have with these others as much as possible. And of course, where possible, we need to make space for others to speak for themselves. In the community of those with post-viral illnesses like long COVID, ME, and similar conditions, there's a lot of social media activism in which people speak for themselves and create knowledge. This is a way in which, those who cannot go outside, for example, can still speak out and contribute to the discourse. But there's currently not a lot of translation between the insights that are created there and general society, academia, and so on. So today we will center some of the voices of patient activists, and then afterwards we can collectively discuss better ways of taking these voices into account in activism, policy, and institutions. I will first show a video by Anil van der Zee, which is called The Days with ME, in which he also speaks about documenting ME. I then read some excerpts from a book, De Achterblijvers, by Anne Vroegindeweij. And after that, Vivienne Matthies-Boon, who's a philosopher who also does long COVID activism, will share her thoughts on the topic. So I will now first share the video and make sure I share it with sound. Let me know if there's no sound, okay? Oh, I need to enter my wachtwoord. This is all.
I let him in, and he snuggles under the covers with me, while I stay awake until my proper alarm goes off.
Anil was just woken up by his cat in the first part of the video.
I massage my legs to facilitate blood circulation and put on my sport stockings. Before I can make it upright to reach the kitchen, I drink a liter of water to alleviate my orthostatic intolerance. Walking feels so contradictive, as my small fiber neuropathy complaints make it difficult for me to feel my feet and legs properly, making walking a challenge. However, due to my autonomic nervous system dysfunction and limited ability to be upright for extended periods, I must lie down as soon as possible as well. I always feel like as though I'm on the brink of fainting, so reaching the kitchen bed requires all my energy and concentration. Once we've made it, I feed Grigor, and I will rest for another 30 minutes.
I'm just skipping forward in the video because it's quite a long video. I will share the link afterwards.
Especially when patients are severely affected by the disease. When I was at my most severe, even using my phone once a day to send a single sentence in a WhatsApp message was difficult. Let alone operating a camera or having a camera crew in my house. Unfortunately, it's often during these moments that the outside world needs to see the reality of this disease. Many medical professionals may not fully understand the severity of ME because patients who are severely affected are often not part of the medical system anymore. That's why I wanted to film myself, even though it may not reflect the time when awareness for my ill state was needed the most. As for walking, it's slightly easier at night, less brightness, yet it still feels like running a marathon. Or in my case, more like performing a heavy ballet that leaves me feeling oxygen deprived and even more dizzy than after a series of pirouettes. Really, my job as a dancer was peanuts compared to dealing with this disease. And its chronic lack of funding, treatment options, care, and potentially harmful treatments. This has been going on for me for 16 years and counting. And for many, it's been a lifelong struggle.
Well, pause the video here. So as you could see, Anil van der Zee used to be a ballet dancer, and he has been ill with ME for a long time. And one of the ways in which he does activist work is by using social media to share updates about his life, but also making these videos. And I will share the link in a bit, because I think that they really show the reality of people living with this illness in a very powerful and emotional way. Then the second voice I want to share is that of Anil Vroegindeweij, who is also a patient activist and a writer. And she wrote a book about long COVID, which is called The Achterblijvers in Dutch, which means those who stayed or were left behind. I will read it in Dutch and I will briefly translate what I read afterwards. Waarom doet iedereen alsof die klote pandemie voorbij is? Voorzichtig trek ik het gordijn een stukje open. Het is bijna helemaal donker, toch pak ik mijn zonnebril van het nachtkastje. Dat is een beweging te veel. Ik val uitgeput weer op het bed, sluit mijn ogen en probeer rustig te ademen. Mijn hart is verhuisd naar mijn hoofd en bonkt daar tegen mijn schedel. In mijn oren suist het alsof ik de hele nacht zonder oordoppen naast de speakers in een club heb gestaan. Ik moet naar de wc. Als ik naast mijn bed sta, piepen mijn longen een beetje. Een halve meter van de wc-deur wordt alles zwart. Ik laat me tegen de deur aanvallen en zak dan voorzichtig op de grond. Daar blijf ik een paar minuten zitten, voorovergebogen met mijn hoofd tussen mijn knieën. Ik probeer het opnieuw, het felle licht op de gang laat ik uit. Terug in bed blijf ik een half uur bewegingloos liggen om op adem te komen. Mijn hart dreunt nu zowel in mijn borstkas als mijn hersenpan. Ik denk aan Twitter, waar de anderen zijn. Ik zie ze voor me, liggen in hun verduisterde kamertjes, tweetend en hopend dat de wereld ze hoort. Hallo, wij zijn hier. Komt iemand ons nog helpen? Maar wat heeft het voor zin? Twitter is als een concertzaal met een grandioze akoestiek en een bak vol muzikanten, maar zonder publiek. En ik kan de weerklank van ons gekerm niet meer verdragen. So in this brief piece, Anna describes how it feels to be very ill. It's a scene in which she goes to the toilet and can't reach it because she's too sick. And she also describes being on Twitter and thinking about the others who are tweeting from their beds or their living rooms in the hope that somebody will hear them. In the book, she describes her own experience with long COVID, but also the medical state of research, and also how and also the lack of care and how these three elements intertwine. Ik vond het best merkwaardig dat nog de huisarts, nog de long COVID-fysio iets over PAM en het mechanisme erachter had gezegd. Zouden ze op hun hoede zijn geweest voor dat griezelige nocebo-effect? Bang dat ik spontaan PAM zou krijgen zodra ik wist wat het was? Of hadden ze er misschien zelf nog nooit van gehoord? Nog steeds is PAM in de zorg vrij onbekend en komt het nauwelijks voor in het curriculum van medische opleidingen. Dat zou kunnen komen omdat het voornamelijk voorkomt bij postinfectieuze ziektes die we nog niet helemaal begrijpen, zoals Q-koorts. Dat betekent overigens niet dat het bestaan ervan discutabel is. Het is een wetenschappelijk onderzocht en aangetoond probleem. Maar omdat veel artsen er weinig tot niets over weten, delen ze nogal eens adviezen uit die het alleen maar erger maken. Zoals meer sporten, meer ondernemen of beweging opbouwen bij een fysiotherapeut. Toch hadden mijn artsen, zowel mijn artsen als ik tijdens de pandemie wel kunnen en naar mijn mening ook moeten horen over het bestaan van PAM. Deskundige virologen en immunologen die vertegenwoordigd waren in het OMT, kunnen niet onbekend geweest zijn met langdurige klachten na een virus en dus ook niet met PAM. Zij hadden de bevolking kunnen waarschuwen en huisartsen de nodige bijscholing kunnen geven. Was het niet de morele plicht van de overheid om ons niet alleen te behoeden voor een IC-opname, maar ook voor een chronische levensverwoestende ziekte die je opsluit in je eigen lichaam en die zelfs een dansje op een nummer van Lady Gaga onmogelijk maakt? So in this second part, Anna describes that the weird situation that her GP, the physiotherapist, and others did not know about the existence of PAM, or at least didn't warn her about this. And she also discusses the responsibility of the government and experts to inform citizens not only about the dangers of acute COVID infections, but also about post-viral conditions. And the final note about Anne Vroegindeweij in this book is that she writes that writing a book, of course, makes it seem as if you can still write a book. But for her, this book really came into being in 15 minutes a day, or even less, maybe a couple of times a week, in which she felt well enough to write something. So it's a very different writing process than most writers have the luxury of experiencing. So these are the first voices that I wanted to share with you. And now I would like to give the mic to Vivienne Matthies-Boon.
I'll just unmute myself. Thank you very much, Eva. So let me first of all introduce myself, because not all of you might know me. I know some of you will, but others won't. So my name is Vivienne Matthies-Boon, and I work at the Radboud University as a professor in ethics and political philosophy. I basically developed long COVID in January 22 after basically after my first infection, and importantly, I live in Germany, thankfully, I would add. Although it's not paradise here, it's not as bad as in the Netherlands. It's kind of mixed. In any case, I live here, but I work in the Netherlands. And then a year later, my then 7-year-old daughter also got COVID again, and she never recovered. She has a very different type of long COVID. It's really very different than what I've never had the cognitive issues, thankfully, I would add, which is also what saved my job. I only had particular physical manifestations. So it's within that kind of embedded situation of having a child that is, chronically ill, as well as being myself chronically ill. It is from that situation that I'm speaking out. And when I say that I've been chronically ill, I should also add that from 22, I was basically in for about a year and a half in a bedbound or housebound state, and then 6 months later I was in a fully bedbound semi-vegetative state. For myself, I have a little bit more clarity now on what's going on, and a lot of it has to is basically immune dysregulation, the same kind of system of immune dysregulation that we see with HIV, that we also now know because of the workings of the spike protein of COVID that basically long COVID people also have. I'm not going to bore you with that. We can talk about that later. But it's gaining also, in a sense, over time, that kind of knowledge as well as direct experience that led me to speak out. And first of all, speak out particularly in the Netherlands, where there was for a very long time this discourse of, we don't know anything yet. We have no idea what's going on. And as if that also excused not doing anything about it. If you don't know anything about it, then you might want to say, actually, that should urge you to do something about it. But the opposite seemed to happen. So it's from within that position that basically using the knowledge that I have, I became active in the Netherlands as a long COVID activist. And then as the ball started rolling, I've kind of withdrawn from that again, and I'm using much more my background as an ethicist to write academic articles on the social and political ethics of long COVID. Now, this session is really about speaking for or speaking about. And it's here that I just want to highlight a few philosophical thoughts. Firstly, is that speaking, even as I'm sitting here, right? Speaking is an embodied act, and it's an embodied act that demands a lot of energy. It demands a lot of the ability to draw in air, ability often to sit uptight. And here I'm just talking to you via screen. If you're in a room, it takes even much more energy. So I think we also have to understand, and this is where we got things, basically we're lagging behind on this quite a lot, certainly within democratic theory and democratic ideas, is this notion that actually speaking out demands forms of ability that often, people don't have. But also speaking out, there's always something missing. And that is simply by virtue of the fact that we use symbolic language to try and capture experiences or ideas, etc., which basically cannot really be captured by words. This, of course, goes back to the old Kantian idea of, the reality of the object can be, we grasp it for the concepts, but it cannot be grasped in, as such. So that's even much more difficult when it gets to people, because witnessing their suffering, you experience it as a witnesser. You can maybe relate to it, but there's also a danger here of projection, so that you project onto the other, parts of your experience, and at least your interpretation. But unfortunately, language is, all we have, right? Of course, there's other forms that we have, like visual arts, other ways of communication, but in a language in a broader sense is what we have. Yeah, I would say that in the context of post-COVID, and by that I mean both the post-COVID illness as well as the situation of supposedly being post-COVID, the pandemic is over. Speaking for or speaking about has been even made more difficult, because speaking about post-viral chronicity distorts some very common assumptions, namely this idea of having a virus is just part of life. Right. Okay. Here we might want to raise the question, well, what about HIV or Ebola? Is that also part of life? It's a difficult conception, right? But it is very much rooted in our everyday understanding. Saying like, oh, virus is just a part of life. Presuming that, oh, it will pass. Again, think of different viruses. Viruses do not always pass. And it's within this context of the pandemic denialism that is basically ongoing, that you see also not only the psychologization of the illness that Eva Meyer has already referred to, but also the psychologization of those who try and speak out against COVID, or basically against the lack of attention for and recognition of long COVID. So basically, those who are active are portrayed often as, a bunch of radicals, as those who are overly fearful, those who need psychological treatment because, they're basically in this doom and gloom story, etc., etc. And the thing is that post-viral chronicity, whether that's in the form of long COVID, MHCFS, HIV, or other forms that might be still coming our way, they remind us of our existential unsafety. They remind us that actually there's a couple of things in life that say also even a Buddhist would, affirm, right? The first thing is we all age, some more than others, because some have a longer and a shorter lifespan. We all get sick, we all die, and we lose all the things we have. And then the question is, how do we deal with it? What do we do with it? Well, I think the latter is where we've particularly gone wrong when it comes to the COVID pandemic, because what we saw happening there is that the notion of atomistic individualism really took hold, as in like the individual being in control of their lives. This is really a illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion, because as a result of that, we see that when those activists are talking about long COVID, they run up against defense mechanisms that are put in place. So no, you are making a problem by pointing this out. You are, again, being fearful. No, it's just, because you're so stressing out about this is why the virus had such an impact, etc., etc. And the problem is that here, this psychologization really also befits this what I would say, this idea of politics, an idea of the self in the neoliberal era, whereby we can all make it if we try, right? There's this notion of if you think well, you will be well. And if you think yourself rich, you will be rich. I mean, it's complete claptrap, but it's very dominant in our lives. And it's particularly pathological when it comes to suffering, because in this context, it becomes very hard to speak for others. Basically, what we often find is when you're engaged in long COVID activism is that it literally falls on deaf ears, a disinterest. And often a disinterest based on the idea, oh, it won't happen to me. And yet, every day, more and more long COVID patients are being added. It's like it's a growing group amongst the old, the young, and everything in between. But also what you then find is that even within the long COVID communities themselves, there is a tendency to say we have to remain positive, because the message of thinking positive, so this psychologization, this root of, if you think positive, it'll be better. There's also this notion of you can't be too negative about long COVID, right? It's like you have to remain positive. And while some might say that it might help to, remain hopeful, or that some patients might need it, there's also a problem with that. And that is that if you're not, particularly in a Dutch context, if you're not positive enough, you become basically portrayed as being a negative complainer, someone who moans all the time. And here I would like to refer back also to Sarah Ahmed's book on complaint, whereby it's the message starts to stick, starts to stick to the person who's telling the message. And so basically the negative experience of long COVID becomes projected onto the person who's speaking for, as in like you are being negative. And so what we then often see is that the actual suffering of long COVID is often only anecdotally shared in stories that are often kind of start to cover up the actual lived reality. And yet the problem is that worlds of patients are broken. And that's not fun, that's not positive. And the problem is that by downplaying, what I often see in the Netherlands, at least, by downplaying this severe negative existential impact that is not just temporary, but that is long-term for many people, that the serious nature of the disability and of the way that it impacts the family, of the person's lives, of their surroundings, is basically not taken seriously enough. So this idea of je moet het gezellig houden, which is what we often find, I don't have a translation for that, but it basically means you have to keep it kind of that is the one word you never translate, but you have to kind of keep it positive, comfortable, etc. There is a denial there of the actual physical and existential suffering that cannot be expressed in words. And so I want to just quickly share a couple of pictures with you to highlight this point. Okay, you should see this now. Because the problem is that, so firstly, first thing first. So firstly, COVID, long COVID is really far out, not gezellig. It is also people who are being negative are often being said, or negative or complain about long COVID. They're often being accused of not being connecting enough, niet verbindend genoeg. And this, I think, is an interesting accusation, because actually COVID completely isolates. In this case, a 7-year-old child for years on end. So long COVID itself is isolating and is not connecting and is not positive. It is deeply disabling, and yet the suffering, even in pictures or in words, cannot be expressed. This is again the same then 7-year-old child. And this is Rosa, a child here from in Kruiskleve, who's in bed since 2020, the first round of COVID. And this is Kati, who's had the same issues also around here. I wanted to share those because I think also we often, when we talk about speaking for, as in the long COVID debates, we often just, refer directly to adults, right? Whereas like the people we also shouldn't forget are the children. Children, we often, they cannot speak for themselves. They lack less of a voice. The voice that they have go through their parents, but their parents become perceived as a threat often. So we often become, it's a parent that become like those that basically keep the illness in place, that are, basically causing the illness through the psychologization lens. And the problem is that these children are often completely invisible. They are less present even on social media channels, which remain in their own bubbles. They are less present in any other ways of forming or being seen. And here, I think, and this is the last point I want to make, is that we run into a circularity of recognition, namely that first, actually, something has to be seen in order to be seen. And often we don't even get there. So first, something has to first be seen in order to be fully seen, as in recognized, so really seen or heard. And so this hearing, there's so many things going on, but in this hearing or in this seeing, we often run up against the defense mechanism of the COVID pandemic. And yet this making those who cannot express their own experiences, either verbally or in other ways, make them visible or make them heard is still very important. But we also have to say it's also very burdensome. Being overloaded with stories of children who are suffering in silence for years on end with no or insufficient medical, Betreuung in German, medical care, or becoming overloaded with patients that start to contact you because, would you maybe know something about medications or other stuff? It puts a burden on patients who are and activists who are trying to speak out, and that existential burden can itself also become what we call vicarious traumatic. So you don't only carry your own trauma, but you start to basically have a whole rucksack full of traumas. And the problem is that when you try and empty that rucksack onto others and say, look, this is what's going on, you run into those defense mechanisms that I said earlier. Yet, and this is the very last point, I think it is nevertheless extremely important because, as Levinas said, that in the face of the suffering other, we cannot forget the particularity of people suffering. So these are real people, they're real, individuals, they're with each of their own particularity. And we cannot let that be swamped away on either numbers, abstractions, or mechanisms of denial.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Vivienne. There are many things that I thought about, but I first want to ask the attendants, all of you here, if you want to ask a question or share your thoughts on this topic. And for those who feel more comfortable with asking their question or speaking in Dutch, please do so, and I will briefly translate your question for the group. You can raise your hand with the raise your hand symbol, or just raise your hand if you have your video on.
But then maybe also suggest people have just comments or stuff, right? So it's not just questions. Let's just talk together, maybe. Yeah.
I saw Annelies raised her hand, and also Emily. Annelies, do you want to go first?
Ja, ik doe het maar in het Nederlands, dus wel zo makkelijk.
Ja,
allereerst dank je wel voor de aandacht die jullie voor onze groep ME-mensen en post-COVID-mensen trachten te bereiken. Het stemt me heel verdrietig als ik Vivienne haar verhaal hoor doen. En ik zit zelf in een WhatsApp-groep met lotgenoten van ME en post-COVID. En we vroegen ons eigenlijk af, wat kunnen wij als patiënten zelf doen? Want men hoort ons niet. We zijn niet zichtbaar. En dan komen wij op het punt dat we de energie niet hebben, de netwerken verloren zijn gegaan, familie en vrienden weg zijn en je inderdaad in een isolement zit.
Ja.
En we vonden het heel moeilijk, want we hebben weliswaar een groepje opgericht, maar we komen er eigenlijk niet uit. En eigenlijk is een beetje de vraag van, kunnen we eigenlijk als patiënt wel wat doen om ons zichtbaarder te maken en minder afhankelijk te zijn?
Ja, ik denk dat...
Let me translate first.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
So Annelies is a member of a group of people with ME and post-COVID, and she wanted to ask if, what are the options for patients because they are not heard. Advocating for yourself is often nearly impossible because you don't have the strength for it. So in what ways can we change the situation or change the discourse so that their voices are heard? What's the scope for change for the patients themselves? And before I give the floor to you, Vivienne, I'd like to say something because I think that I had long COVID for 2 years, and I've been quite lucky because I've recovered quite well last year. So I've been gradually moving up, and I'm doing quite well. But I do feel a responsibility because I know the experience well, and I also know that it's very difficult to speak for yourself when you are that ill. And like you say, Annelies, you become completely isolated because you simply don't have the power to have all of these social relations and work and all of that. So what I've been trying to do is look for pathways to make the disease more visible by organizing this series, but also by writing a book about it and by creating a collective art project in which I collected experiences of others. But I do think we need people to translate as well, precisely because the disease is so debilitating. So maybe there can be new formats of activism in which the voices of those who don't have a lot of energy for activism can be heard, but there are also others who do have the power to do this. And one way in which we can do so is by connecting different struggles. I think this is very important. I come from animal activism and environmental activism, so I think it's and I think many social justice struggles are interrelated. So I think it's very important that we connect between groups, and I think that people in this group are very isolated also when you look at the wider spectrum of social justice activism. So I think there's something that can be gained there, especially in the Netherlands. We don't have a lot of disability activism like in the States, for example. So new connections, new formats for activism, and people that do have the strength to speak out should or can do that for others.
I would also add to that we need, and I'm sorry for being a bit direct here, but we need disruptive politics in the Netherlands around this issue. Because whilst of course, I mean, like I agree with everything that you've said, right? I mean, totally. especially academic output and whatever. But what we also really need are, in that sense, and this is where the biggest problem is boots on the ground. And this is where I've seen a huge difference, though, between the Netherlands and Germany, where, again, I always want to remain quite clear. Germany is not the Valhalla of long COVID stuff. It really is not. It's also dire, and people also, you're running from one place to the other, and it's a nightmare. But here we have, for instance, there's a much more a tradition of going out there in demonstrations by family members. For instance, they go out on demonstrations in liegend demos, so lying down demos, or other forms. I also think that actually we need much more visual and symbolic disruptive stuff. So for all I care, we make, I don't know, a line of bed sheets, right? So tie up everyone's bed sheet of every long COVID patients and see how long that thing would be and how long we can get through the whole of the Netherlands with that. For instance, we need those kind of symbolic, like in actions on the ground that become visible also for people. Because the problem is that what's very clear, and this is also what was said by the Ministry of VWS in several different meetings that I've also attended, is that as soon as social support for anything related to the pandemic started to wane, which it does in any crisis, right? And also never mind about how they handled it. I'm not even going to go into that, but like any crisis, after a while, support starts to dwindle. But rather than taking the lead and providing structural support for people with long COVID through solidaristic acts, so for instance, giving out of masks, starting awareness campaigns, these were all voted out as no. And now what we also see is that basically, people just don't have the proper information on long COVID around. So there needs to be, like in Germany, from the ministry out, a health and awareness campaign, Postbus 51 or whatever that used to be, with regards to long COVID. And that really has to be done. At the same time, I also would like to say that there is, of course, two issues here in terms of speaking out that I also had to think of. Often when you speak out as a patient, you become labeled as being, hysteric, etc., right? And here, if I'm really honest, and I hate saying this because I'm really fundamentally opposed to this, it's helped me that I work at the Radboud University as a professor in and head of department of, because when you can introduce yourself in that way, people start to take you, like especially I'm talking about ministries and whatever, right? They suddenly relate differently, which I think is a real issue, and always has been. It's ridiculous, but I think unfortunately it does work that way, which also means that more, in that sense, what Eva said, more networking would be good. At the same time, what I've also seen, particularly in academia, is that a lot of the patients want to remain invisible. They don't want to be seen. Because I've tried to set up networks, within academics, and we're seeing it also in Germany, where we're starting a platform on academics with long COVID, is that they're too afraid of appearing weak. And so they basically say, we don't want to talk about it. We're too afraid, because if we appear weak, our career might end, or we might not be regarded as the successful and researcher, or the one that they'll want to hire. This is especially important for those who are in the earlier stages of their career, right? And I think that's also really problematic. It also shows how much violence, and that's, I'm sure it's not just the case for academics, but can be the case for anyone, how much violence is also internalized. And I really always feel actually really sorry also, because suffering, and often these people still suffer, have a lot of physical complaints, and suffering on your own in silence, making yourself invisible, pretending everything is okay. We all know that as long COVID patients, one day just pretending to be a bit better, right? But if you have to, in a sense, be in denial on this, I do feel sorry. Really sorry for them, not like sorry in a, denigrating way.
Yeah, but I think this also points to a larger problem with the discourse and the public debate, because I've noticed at the times when I did write about long COVID, I've written columns about it for national newspapers and other articles, but you just get really, I really got death threats for writing about long COVID of COVID deniers, and just you really, really nasty. And I don't care, because I get them also when I write about animals or refugees. So for me, it's absolutely impersonal. I don't mind. I see a very long email and I think, oh, that took you a long time, and throwing it away is one second. But still, it's the whole discourse is very problematic. But I hope you don't mind, Vivienne. I have some remarks in the chat, and Emily also had a hand up. So Emily, I will just briefly read the texts in the chat and then I will come to you. Annelies van Eijsten mentioned that Julian Bushof's amendment for extra money for research was turned down today in Dutch Parliament, and also has a remark about symbolic actions, and writes that there's not even proper registration in the Netherlands from the government about how many people there are with post-COVID. And that's true. Frieke and Anto have a remark about the podcast Niet Hersteld, which is a Dutch podcast made by long COVID patients. And they also mention thinking about Michiel Weerthof attempts to address long COVID for a broader public with a one-time podcast and photography project called Even Liggen. So in short, they want to emphasize that a lot of patients are being creative online, for example, on Instagram, making art and being vulnerable and open. And then there are some other remarks about the discussions at the workplace. I think responding to what Vivienne just said about the difficulties of speaking about long COVID professionally. Emily, I want to ask you if you have something to say to us.
Yeah, thank you for this. I'm thinking in general about the obstacles we face when we try to speak about long COVID at all, whether it's our own long COVID, somebody else's long COVID, just the topic in general, right? Eva's getting death threats. It's not easy to speak about it for many reasons. Earlier when Vivienne was speaking, you mentioned that one of the obstacles we face is other people's desire to just live their life, and then this misplaced belief that ignoring COVID is a way to live one's life. So this, you referred to it as a neoliberal individualistic impulse. And I'm wondering about the opposite of that as another barrier we face sort of simultaneously, which I would describe as a kind of death drive that we're also coming up against in the general public who doesn't care about COVID nor wants to hear about COVID or long COVID, which is people seem to be sort of developing beliefs about, basically developing self-destructive beliefs about the role of viruses in their lives, and also just seeking out maybe shorter lifespans in a twisted understanding of what the proper response is to COVID. Just yesterday, I'm in the United States. Just yesterday, we pulled out of the World Health Organization. Right? I view this as like the American death drive on display.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, Vivienne and Eva and anybody else, what your thoughts were on this kind of simultaneous obstacle that exists alongside this live your life desire to just move on.
But I think actually they're not personally, but I wonder what others think. But for me, I totally get what you're saying, by the way. And I also really agree with you. I'm not sure that it's the opposite, though, however. I think that actually there's inherent neoliberal vision of the self as determining your life, like that your life is makeable. You can make it into whatever, you if you try it, you'll make it, whatever, that kind of stuff, leads to a certain form of hedonism, which actually leads to this kind of death drive. So this belief, so I think that they're actually not opposites, as you said, but I think they're inherently connected. That's all I have to say on that personally. But I think it's a really good point.
I also really appreciate this point. We don't have so much time, so I would like to ask Erin to jump in.
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to say that I also see that link between those two things in a way. Seeing like an added layer of that is like everyday people reconciling kind of like their powerlessness in this machine, in this neoliberal machine. And for a lot of people, that reconciliation looks like my life is not in my hands. And so I can't preserve myself against the state and what environment the state facilitates and permits to exist or not exist. And so for that reason, and then you cue that death drive that you mentioned, it's that they're not going to protect me. I feel powerless to protect myself. I don't know how to advocate for myself. And so, cue all of like the masses that are kind of buying into that, the idea that, oh, if it gets me, it gets me. I'm not going to do anything about it.
Yeah, and what I always, because it's actually not just in the US, I will also have to think of a colleague who basically said, if I get long COVID, then I'll just get long COVID. And I was also thinking, like, you can only say that when you don't realize the severity of the illness. Because once you would get long COVID, you will tell me a very different story, right? I mean, I just had to think of that as a first response. But I think it's also, in that sense, it is the state reverting to a idea of individual responsibility in light of a highly contagious, thus intersubjective disease. That's really problematic, both ethically, practically, pragmatically, in all the different ways. And so in some way, people are right to say, I cannot fully protect myself, right? I mean, they are correct. I mean, you can do things. You can wear good fitting FFP2, FFP3 mask or KN95, different names sometimes used around. You can ventilate, HEPA filters and all the rest, and it works. But often you do feel quite, I mean, even with those who want to protect themselves, you feel quite, like abandoned, left to your own, devices. And I think that sense of abandonment is probably part of it. It's felt by those who want to protect themselves, but it's also felt, I think, by those, who might not feel that way, but more broadly, which is why we also have this political alienation, et cetera, going on. But that's a whole different, I'm going into a whole different discussion, but it does play in on this. And that's why I think also, and that's one of the things I found actually most frustrating in all of this, is that the social activists that you would normally expect to really pick up on issues of social and political justice, they've just been quiet, like others, and that's the bit that I don't understand. So those who would normally speak out on, you know, women's rights, on gay rights, on whatever, right? All of these issues.
Yeah, but
I've not been hearing them.
Yeah, but I also don't generally advocate for non-human animals. So I think it's very similar. If a group can't advocate for themselves, then the check is not there. You know, you're not going to be called out upon certain issues. Maybe this is very cynical.
No, yeah.
But we can discuss that some other time. I was reminded through both your and Erin's remarks also of the last conversation in which I spoke with Christopher Sebastian, and we discussed mouth masks a lot, and also the psychological mechanisms of people denying that there is still a risk for them. And so folks who are interested in that, we spoke about that for quite some time, and Christopher had some nice views about that as well. I want to wrap up because I know that some of you have been holding on for an hour, which is lovely and very good and much appreciated. If there are any last questions or remarks, please shoot. And otherwise, the next session will be on February 4th at 12 o'clock with Femke van het Hout. And the day before that, February 3rd, there's a symposium on post-viral ethics organized by Vivienne in Nijmegen. I will post the link on the Long COVID Conversations website for those who are interested, and we also sent it around through the mailing list. And I want to thank you all very much, especially Vivienne, but also Anil van der Zee and Anne Vroegindeweij, who contributed their work to this conversation. And I really hope we can continue this talk, because I feel that there's much more to be said about this topic specifically. So maybe later in the year. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care and see you next time.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.